Well, welcome. We are so glad you are joining us today. My name is Joe Swimmer. I'm the Executive Director of the CEEP Network. And on behalf of the CEEP Network and the Lake Institute, we are so pleased to be bringing this conversation today to you all about the intersections of faith and philanthropy. We look forward to hearing from our two panelists and the moderator, Melissa, as the conversation unfolds. And we invite you to submit your questions or comments to the chat feature. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to the Lake Institute's own Melissa Spaz. And thank you once again for joining us today. Melissa?
Thank you, Joe, and welcome everyone. I'm really pleased to be able to be with you. My name is Melissa Spaz. I'm the Managing Director for Education and Engagement at the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving, which is part of Indiana University's Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. And it truly is my privilege to be part of convening this conversation and to spend an hour in dialogue with our two distinguished visitors, Dan Cardinali and Kerry Robinson. I'm going to introduce them each to you, but also want to just offer a word about the framing for this conversation, because both Dan and Kerry are remarkable leaders, creative thinkers, and people from whom I have had the privilege of learning in a variety of different contexts over the years. And so in thinking about bringing them together, what I knew was that there would be an opportunity for us to think together intentionally about the intersections between their respective sector foci or areas of expertise in philanthropy, in nonprofits broadly, and specifically, and of interest to the Lake Institute especially, related to faith. Now, it's tremendous for us to be able to be hosted as well by the CEEP Network, the Consortium of Endowed Episcopal Parishes, and to be able to have that perspective as lifelong learners and as learners who are thinking both around leadership and around institutions and the way that institutions work and learn. First, Dan Cardinali, President and CEO of Independent Sector, which is, for those of you who might be unfamiliar, the only national membership organization that truly brings together a very diverse set of nonprofits, foundations, and corporations. So it is in that diversity of independent sector that there is some real strength and a very unique perspective. Dan has worked in the field of public education, and he serves in a variety of ways in the sector and in philanthropy, including in his work on the board of Child Trends and the advisory boards of Harvard Business School's Social Enterprise Initiative, the Conference Board's Center on Corporate Citizenship and Philanthropy, and Project Evident, and he is a trustee of the Fetzer Institute. Now, an important point of commonality is that Dan has an undergraduate degree from Georgetown, as does Kerry Robinson, who comes to us from her leadership experience and role as the founding executive director and partner at Leadership Roundtable. Kerry has a background in philanthropy as a lifelong member of the Raskob Foundation for Catholic Activities and a leader in FATICA, Foundations and Donors Interested in Catholic Activities. And she is a trusted advisor, a wise thinker in a wide range of national and international organizations, particularly those serving the Catholic Church. And she has been a very impactful fundraiser, notably raising significant funds to support the St. Thomas More Catholic Chapel and Center at Yale University. And it's truly my privilege to welcome Kerry back as a distinguished visitor for Lake Institute, in large part because her book, Imagining Abundance, is something that I share broadly with Lake Institute's educational program constituents on a weekly basis. It's something that has been very influential for me in my thinking. But Dan, Kerry, thank you for being with us. Really a privilege to have your wisdom, your perspective, and to have you in conversation as friends and longtime colleagues as well. Now, I'm sure that we could have started this conversation in a variety of ways and from a variety of starting points. But I'm cognizant that we are all living in a season of ongoing disruption and change. I've taken to referring to this time as late pandemic because I am confident that it's disingenuous to say that we are post-pandemic. So much has changed in the way that we work, in the way that we relate, in the way that our institutions are functioning, and the kinds of challenges that they are encountering. And so I wonder, in this season of disruption and change, perhaps also a season of opportunity, what are the most significant challenges that you each see the organizations that you work with encountering across the nonprofit sector? What are the wicked problems that you're encountering as observers and conveners? Dan, maybe you would lead us off thinking particularly from your vantage point.
Sure. First of all, thank you, Melissa and Joe, for the invitation. And it is a real honor, as always, to be with Kerry. And I look forward to the conversation. And I hope we can kind of wrestle down, because I don't think there are easy answers here. From my vantage point, I see, let me give you the headline first, which is actually the wicked problem, as you kind of posed it, is a crisis of trust in institutions right now. And what are the drivers that I see, and I see folks wrestling with? You've mentioned enough. The pandemic obviously has laid bare what we were sensing, but had grown pretty complacent in the inequities around racial inequities, economic inequities. But there are some existential forces as well, like climate change and this 25-year journey towards polarization. So you throw that with technology and the global reordering of power, with China coming up, really calling into question the really supremacy of democracy, especially American democracy, and really raising a question about whether that is in fact the prevailing global framework for bringing people forward with full agency. So I think we're at a moment where civil society organizations, nonprofits, philanthropic institutions, corporations that are involved in really trying to promote civil society are asking fundamental questions about what they should do. And the problems are larger than what most of us have been trained to do, which is kind of isolate a very particular problem, become very expertise, and focus in on a theory of change that helps either address a particular component of that problem or eventually, contribute to a larger body of work. And so all these forces have destabilized nonprofits' trust in themselves, as well as the American public's trust in nonprofits and philanthropy. So, annually we do a report with Edelman, really testing Americans' opinions about how much they trust nonprofits and philanthropy. And I have to say there's downward pressure on whether or not folks really believe this sector will be what it has historically been in the US, which is an engine of incredible social, environmental transformation and change, and really contributing to the health of the country. So we have a trust problem, a self-confidence problem in ourselves. And we can talk more about it. I think the way sometimes we are driving our work is trying to get our heads around small problems that don't necessarily contribute to the more dramatic existential questions that are before us.
Thank you for that, Dan. It is distinct privilege to hear from you from the vantage point of independent sector, looking across a complex and broad landscape of nonprofit organizations. And I wonder, Kerry, for you, thinking specifically about the religious landscape, do the challenges that Dan named resonate with you? Are there other distinct challenges that you would note or lift up?
First of all, I am in the business of always agreeing with Dan, and how he framed that is exactly germane to the work that we were doing, helping to strengthen the Catholic Church during this time of crisis in particular. Very early on in the pandemic, we referred to pandemic in the plural for the reasons that Dan has outlined. But I want to speak specifically about the context of the church, also knowing that many of our guests and participants here come from a faith-based background. The very first thing that happened to us before the lockdown was we at Leadership Roundtable held our annual summit. It was an in-person gathering of some 260 leaders across the country, across sector, across industry, and from the church itself. And it was a prophetic moment for us to focus on some of the challenges pre-pandemic that the church was grappling with. And certainly the restoration of trust, which is a theme Dan has highlighted right from the outset here for us, is a major factor in the work that we do. We were born out of the abuse crisis in 2002, and the restoration of trust, ushering in a new culture of leadership and best managerial practices, is absolutely essential to our mission. So we have this gathering in person, and then immediately the country, the world goes into lockdown. And we had the presence of mind to convene the leaders of all of the major national Catholic public ministries in education, healthcare, charity, as well as the Bishops' Conference and the Papal Nuncio and the men's and women's religious communities. So essentially, we kept it to 20 people so that we could all see each other on Zoom. But we convened very early in the pandemic. And our role as convener was simply to call the question, what are your most pressing challenges? What are your most immediate needs? For Catholic health care, it was providing protective equipment for all of their employees and volunteers. You know, it was immediate and visceral. And we listened for commonalities. And at the time, we concluded two things. One was, whenever there is crisis, whether it is external or exogenous, the church and the nonprofit sector broadly is called on to respond. When people are suffering, people look to faith-based nonprofits to help. And so just at the moment when the church was being asked to do much, much more in terms of basic alleviation of human suffering, providing healthcare, consolation, pastoral services, etc., they were also worried, all of these institutions were worried about their own economic fragility. And so hearing all of that, we convened more and more leaders to get as much information as we could, and we came up with two strategies. The first is there is strength in unity, and I know this is another maxim that Dan holds dearly. So the more we could showcase the church as broader than just bishops or just one's parish or just one's favorite Catholic charity, but the entire church in action, that would be to our advantage. And then we began working on strategies for the short, medium, and long-term response to economic insecurity. And I will just close by saying that our opening was, the church is not empty, it has been deployed. And our job was to try to strengthen it fiscally, in terms of morale, in terms of anything it needed, particularly best managerial practices and leadership, so that it could respond to the crisis at hand.
Well, to kind of build off of something I think that Kerry modeled so beautifully in how she and her colleagues as a faith-based institution stepped, and as civil society leaders that had both deep local roots and had a network that could make sense of the particular experience into a trend and could diagnose then what was going on. It was the actual institutional nature of the way the Catholic Church in this case was designed, and leadership that had figured out how to work together to respect the subsidiarity of local community, but could also see trends. That's point number one that I think becomes really important as we think about the future. The second that is particular to this conversation is the dual role of both direct response to an imminent crisis and the theological and hard-won lived wisdom of that institution to accompany those congregants, whether directly Catholics or those they're serving, to help make sense of this moment of suffering and crisis. So it is the dual ability to both meet immediate, real-life human existential needs and the meaning-making work that's so incredible is a source of hope and a sense of remaining connected to yourself and to community. And for those of us of faith, to a sense of God's spirit alive in the world, even in the midst of this. And it just is a powerful, powerful example of why institutions still are so critically important, even though they're under siege and need fundamental reworking. So it was just such a beautiful case study that she laid out there. I just thought it was amazing.
Thank you for lifting it up, Dan, because I do think that there's something really wonderful about the way in which the two of you in your respective locations have both breadth and depth in understanding how institutions relate to subsidiary organizations or to related entities, sometimes formally, where there is a great deal of authority and a clear line, and often in a networked capacity or a collaborative capacity. I see that, Dan, in the way in which you seek to organize and to build some influence and capacity across the sector, the nonprofit sector more generally. I wonder, and this is directed to both of you, but sort of thinking in two parts about some of the other distinctive strengths that you can identify assets among the organizations that you serve. You've said very clearly here that balance between negotiating a direct response and making meaning, bringing wisdom, or in the case of religious institutions, a theological understanding to the kinds of problems that we encounter. But I wonder if there are other areas where particularly the philanthropic part of the sector, by which I mean foundations, funders, grant makers, donors, might affirm and reinforce some of the strengths of our nonprofit institutions in the way that you've articulated them, or in some other ways that perhaps it's not always as obvious, either to the institutions themselves or to those philanthropic entities.
Well, I think a lot about hidden assets or underutilized assets. And in the context of the church writ large, one of the underutilized assets is the expertise and social entrepreneurial rigor, the innovation of laity. That has for far too long been underutilized, particularly in the Catholic context. And I'm very happy you're bringing philanthropy into this, because I was really struck by the sincerity, dedication, and immediate desire of religious philanthropists to meet regularly, to be in touch with one another, to ask the question, what are you doing for your grantees? How can we do philanthropy differently in a time of crisis? What are your grantees needing the most? And that issued in rapid learning and sharing of best practices throughout the Catholic philanthropic community for sure, and I think others as well. And it was obvious things initially. You can relax any matching requirement, or you can extend the grant period, or you can advance year two's funding now when it is needed the most, things like that. There was a lot of healthy discussion about dipping into one's endowment to provide an increase of funding right now. But then there were more creative ideas too. And I want to single out two. One was the brainchild of my friend Kathleen Mahoney in her auspices with the GHR Foundation. And what she observed was there may be distrust of institutions and leaders across the globe, across sectors and industry, but for the most part, women religious nuns are trusted. Not only are they trusted, they are out there in the lives, the concrete lives of people, witness to their suffering and their need, and they're responding. So she conceived of equipping 1,000 women religious each with $1,000, and she had this fundraiser essentially, and people loved it because it removed all of the red tape. None of the women religious had to apply for this grant money. They were simply trusted to spend it alleviating human suffering in the most creative, best way that they knew. And all that was asked of them was that they share the story of how they had spent the money. So sisters on the front line, you know, a simple example, but a creative one that galvanized many, many funders in support of this. And the stories are deeply moving and meaningful. And I think when we witness generosity and selflessness and the alleviation of suffering and consolation, it calls that out of us so that we want to likewise be instruments of grace.
So I'm going to build on the wisdom Kerry's put out. I agree with it. I'm going to be a little abstract because she just gave such a beautiful case study. First, I would look to civil society, so nonprofit charitable organizations, philanthropy, as two inextricably linked parts of a healthy response. And I think the pandemic helped remind us profoundly of that. And Kerry mentioned a number of the things I saw that were really, I thought, powerful reminders and really healthy responses philanthropy made. Shifting from programmatic to general operating grant, release of kinds of restrictions, a kind of holding on, putting on hold people, the philanthropic institutions' theories of change, and being much more directly prompted by the wisdom of community through nonprofits to then help shape how they philanthropically gave and how they accompanied. The example of having women religious who are in sense attached to often nonprofit institutions that are in community is a perfect and powerful example of being directly trusted as having their fingers on the pulse beat of what is going on in community. So those, I think, were all really powerful examples, and I'm really encouraged by what I saw happen. So just really, as they say in Zoom language, +1ing what Kerry just said. I do want to add two dimensions that I think are worth thinking about. One on the very hidden asset that Kerry mentioned. Religious communities of almost all of the major world religions have a kind of expertise in redemptive wisdom. And we are living in a moment when we are thoroughly reinterrogating the American narrative. Regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum, you are, it's unavoidable. And we are quickly falling into otherizing and scapegoating. And the sector itself can be pulled into this. In fact, I see it all the time. And we can talk more about this kind of political sectarianism that is very, very powerful force. it is in fact religious institutions that have been, this isn't the first rodeo, many of them have gone on. And so they can pull on and pull the kind of wisdom of their traditions and pull back from the forces, these centrifugal forces of polarization, and introduce a different way of proceeding that doesn't otherize your opponent, but brings them as kind of part of the beloved community. So we can't, as we move from direct response, crisis response that the current set of forces have introduced to us, and we begin to move into rebuilding, it is this redemptive wisdom that the faith traditions have as pearls that the country desperately needs in order to be able to hold the interrogation of different ideas without the dehumanization in the way we go about doing that.
Thank you, Dan. I really appreciate that turn of phrase, the redemptive wisdom. And I'm struck by the way in which I've heard you talk about that degree of meaning making and your efforts to allow that to strengthen independent sector's work broadly, not only with self-consciously or explicitly faith-based or religious nonprofit organizations, but with other civil society organizations who are intent on making constructive change, but in need of some space for that kind of meaning making. And I wonder if we do want to just sort of continue along this line, because it is clear to me that in a meaningful sense, nonprofit organizations, religious institutions, philanthropic institutions are part of the civic infrastructure that we've relied on in our country to offer some capacity to be both locally engaged and globally connected, to maintain some broader view of the good, of collective action. And I think that we are in agreement in this conversation that comes with some capacity and an agility that might drive toward positive transformation and be a counter force against some of those forces that incentivize us to fly apart, to that fragmentation or political sectarianism that you referred to, the thing that seems to dominate in our public discourse. And clearly, Kerry, this is too often very evident in church or religious institutions also. So I wonder, as we're talking about this, as we're talking about that meaning making, what are the practices? What are the conditions for a corrective on the part of nonprofit organizations? What does it look like to drive back together rather than succumbing to the forces that have us flying apart?
Well, let me begin so Dan can rescue me here. This is something that keeps me up at night. I mean, I'm anguished as an American that our country is so divided. I am anguished as a member of humankind that our world is so divided, that pandemics exacerbate the inequities that already exist, and that we are categorizing each other unfairly and without any prudential judgment. Sometimes you can be labeled and categorized simply for the publications that you subscribe to. And in the context of our faith, in the context of my faith, where we are called around one Eucharistic table to see the church so divided, when the church is necessary in the rebuilding, it is a necessary and valuable component to moving us forward. That really hurts my heart. And I've thought a lot about what the remedies are. So one one thing I would stake my life on is that diversity really, truly, deeply matters. Diversity, as imaginatively as we can think about that word. We are all myopic, all of us, whether individually or in our narrowly defined groups. We need to solve for our own myopia. We need the diversity of perspectives and viewpoints and expertise and experience and analysis to analyze the challenges that are before us more coherently and fully, and to create together solutions moving forward. So in the context of the church, I am an advocate of the role of women in the church. And I say, it is not that women are smarter than men, that laity are more capable than those who are ordained. It's simply that diversity matters, and we need each other. We need each other's experience and viewpoint to be healthier and whole. So that's the first remedy, is just having a discipline to bring people who are different than us around a table. Pope Francis refers to it as encounter and accompany. He's not suggesting that we do this just so that there's one group of people who can help another group. It is mutual conversion of mind and heart. And I think having a discipline to do that and establishing ground rules of candor and charity will go a long way in this impasse that we seem to be in.
So I am struggling to answer this question in two different ways. So let me be transparent. As a practicing Catholic, I believe in loyal dissent, and I can join with full-throatedly Kerry's point. Absolutely. I believe in institutions. I believe at the end of the day, particularly in chaotic situations, strong institutions are critically important, and hopefully permeable and open to transformation with a sense of urgency tempered by wisdom. So that is, that's how I processed what Kerry just said, and there's a very strong part of me. So there's another part of me that is more philosophical, and so, and that would be kind of a notion of Hegelian notion of history, that there are times when there is natural and necessary disruption and breakdown in systems and institutions that is just about the way the world works. And to the extent that we can tolerate without falling into dehumanizing, counterproductive ways in which breakdown takes place, then, and the signs of that are the otherizing. When you start attacking people instead of ideas, when you start absolutizing institutional power over its ability to be actually a force for environmental and human flourishing, you know you've ventured out into the zone that is counterproductive. But short of that, to the point that Kerry made around what I would call civic virtues, charitable virtues around engagement that can tolerate the transforming forces, I think we then step into a really creative, albeit enormously disorienting moment. And again, I would appeal to faith-based institutions as having had real wisdom in navigating these. They also can be powerful forces for incremental progress when really categorical progress needs to take place. So the questions I ask in my day job at Independent Sector is, to Kerry's point about diversity, who is authorized to actually name and interrogate the problems? Who is authorized to be able to name and believe in the solutions? And who is authorized to be able to execute against the solutions that are collectively developed? Answering those questions helps us fundamentally ask about diversity, but also power and allocation of resources and authority. And I think we start then having to pull who is in the boardroom, whose voice. So at Independent Sector, who gets to determine what the public policy issues that we focus in on that say we're going to drive a healthy and equitable sector? how do we actually interrogate those ideas, and who is allowed and authorized to challenge the prevailing wisdom and force us to reimagine? So we're not very good at this, but we are stretching ourselves in this direction for the reasons that I mentioned.
I suspect many of our participants are just taking this in and thinking about some of the ways in which we might respond in our own contexts. One thing that I'm just really mindful of, and I'm grateful to both of you for this this sort of complex picture of the way in which we might build capacity to do things differently. While we might draw on some strengths that come from the history, the tradition, the authority of religious institution, there's also a energy that comes perhaps in another direction. And I know one way in which we've talked about this, and I'd be interested to hear you speak to it, is also about the dynamic between a leadership orientation. Kerry, you referred to Pope Francis and some of the ways in which he has shaped conversation in Catholic spaces. And on the other hand, a grassroots movement orientation to change. I think this also intersects with some of the dynamic between internal pressures and external pressures for change, and how institutions navigate the balance between preservation and care for the institution for its own sake, and good stewardship of the mission for which the institution is conceived, designed, intended, and that there are just tensions along the way here that leaders in nonprofit organizations are called on to attend to. And when we are willing to have a conversation that also addresses power, it complicates this anew. So I wonder, as you think about the responses that you each have offered, is there something that you would point to as being particularly affirming or encouraging, or maybe something that is a challenge that you're wrestling with actively?
I'm glad you introduced the word stewardship in that. Stewardship is a funny word for many people. I grew up with this curious word because our great grandparents established a family foundation whose mission was to support the Catholic Church in all of its ministries and apostolates anywhere in the world, and wanted their children and descendants to serve as volunteers in a non-remunerative manner as stewards of the foundation's resources. So even as a kid, I was introduced to this word stewardship, and I've spent my life wrestling with what does proper stewardship look like. And one definition of stewardship is the proper care of all that has been entrusted to one. If we each did that, we would be doing pretty well with our lives. The proper care of all that has been entrusted to us. But I think for the visionary, for the person of faith in particular, stewardship is a little bit more than just that. It also includes the recognition of and proper care of the potential at hand. So if we are seeing life through the lens of potential before us, and don't we have a responsibility to act on that potential, to bring that potential to fruition, especially when it will benefit others. and I truly think that this is the call to all people of faith, is to think about stewardship in terms of stewarding potential. Most of us have such busy lives and many, many responsibilities, and I don't discount those. But we also have to have people who are willing to recognize potential, and it requires change and doing things differently and taking risks. But when our intentions are sound, and when the orientation is to contribute to the fabric of our communal life, our cities, our countries, our common home, then I think we have an obligation to be good stewards of potential. And crises can help us in this. They aren't only bad things for humankind. If it rouses us out of our lethargy, if it causes us to reevaluate our priorities, if it gets us to be other-centered, there is a grace in that, provided we follow through.
I'm kind of metabolizing Kerry's answer, which I think is really extraordinary. And I'm just struck by the invitation, I think, to individual leaders and leader institutions or leadership at institutions for a kind of reflective practice that holds, I think, the invitation Kerry made, that there is from a kind of faith perspective, there is a constant possibility of transformation, and to be paying attention and leaning into it courageously, recognizing that it will inevitably require co-creation and change. And so it feels very, very right, the way she framed that. How do I think about it in my day job? I can use a case study about what we're learning that might be valuable. Some people on the may be aware of when I first came to independent sector, we made the decision to kind of suppress the old trade association conference and to begin to reimagine how the sector needed to come together in this time, the kind of early part of the 21st century. So what we did is we reworked the conference to this thing called Upswell, which aspires to be locally grounded in the lived experience of folks who are touching on nationally relevant issues, so that we're constantly looking through the lens of what are we stewarding our responsibility of looking across the whole, and then believing that within the context of people's lives, they have the DNA, or sometimes fully or almost fully baked responses to the challenges. And so we then have begun to lift up those learnings on using to Kerry's point about stewardship, the potential of a national platform, to say, you who never saw yourself as a national innovator have broken through on something that's critically important. And we want to accompany you to share that in a way that doesn't extract your wisdom and then leave you high and dry, but does share that wisdom as something we see you, the invitation to steward on behalf of civil society. I think we are at maybe a 1.0 version of a multi-version iteration. It's very hard for a national organization to do this. And so we are evolving and growing and building competencies. But it is this attempt to steward I can do all sorts of analysis of how independent sector became a special interest trade association. And that's very gratifying, and it's very analytical and fun, but doesn't really advance anything other than name a problem. So what does it mean to step into the work, to be public in your failures and your learning, and continuously iterate? And I will say this is a great example where philanthropy was willing to take risks with us. Early on, the Fetzer Institute, before I was on the board, Bob Ross at the California Endowment, were just two leaders who said, I'm not sure this is going to work, but we think it is worth trying to figure out. And then we had lots and lots of community-based leaders say, don't really understand what you're doing, but we kind of trust your mojo, and so we'll step in and figure this out. And it's been at times a complete cluster, and other times we've had these wonderful breakthroughs. So I think, to Kerry's point, the potential of saying there's something here, we're not quite sure what it is, but we're willing to kind of mysteriously step into it. And the collective intelligence that comes from a vantage point of national leadership with some people who, have real assets, and then community-based wisdom that have real assets, and then pooling those together. So it's a work in progress, happy to continue to share, but it's certainly been our attempt to live this reworking or this reinvention of voice and power and authorization so that our public policy is grounded in real issues.
I really love that, Dan, and I love the way that this example illustrates what you've said about asking and then answering the question of who is authorized to name a problem and who is equipped to provide a solution, and then to execute on those solutions. Because I think that, to Kerry's point, sometimes there can be a creativity in a disruption, and perhaps it's a disruption we'd never have sought. A global pandemic, a crisis of racism. I mean, there are so many places in which we're intervened upon by something that we would not have chosen. But if we are willing to allow the potential to act on us, there can be creativity and opportunity that we wouldn't have imagined. I'm struck too that frankly, that technology enables so much of this by leveling access and opening up spaces that might have been otherwise rarefied, because there's no longer the prohibitive dimension of expensive travel or convening, but instead the platform becomes much more accessible to many more people, and the scale of an organization is less relevant to its ability to communicate what they're learning. Kerry, I want to give you an opportunity to respond.
Well, I have been quoting Pope Francis a lot in the context of this moment that we collectively, globally are in together. And there's one small passage that I would like to share because I think it's really relevant as we look forward. He says in his book, conveniently published during the pandemic, Let Us Dream, he says, "Now more than ever, what is revealed is the fallacy of making individualism the organizing principle of society. What will be our new principle? We need a movement of people who know we need each other, who have a sense of responsibility to others and to the world. We need to proclaim that being kind, having faith, and working for the common good are great life goals that need courage and vigor. While glib superficiality and the mockery of ethics have done us no good. The modern era, which has developed equality and liberty with such determination, now needs to focus on fraternity and sorority with the same drive and tenacity to confront the challenges ahead. This will enable freedom and equality to take its rightful place in the symphony." When I read that and meditate on it, it's challenging, but it evokes in my own religious sensibility that core to Christianity is the Paschal mystery. Out of suffering and dying comes new life. And when we are at our most despairing, most despondent, that is exactly the moment for people of faith where we need to be witnesses to the new life which we in faith believe will come. So all of these pandemics that we have talked about, racial injustice, polarization, harm to our planet, the virus, COVID-19, there is a suffering and dying in all of this that is apparent, that no one is immune to. We need our leaders, particularly our nonprofit leaders, our faith-based leaders, to be bearing witness to the new life that is to come as a sign of hope for moving forward.
Amen. Honestly, that was fabulous, and I think spot on, and I think easily translatable into profound secular language that can appeal to obviously non-believers, as well as can be easily translated across multiple traditions. I just think it's spot on, and I would just put forth, imagine if what Kerry just said, if we turn to our faith-based leaders who are bearing witness to the renewal that the moment that we're on, and we're prompted by their learning and their reflections, what a force for transformation that could be.
I'm struck by the way in which this leadership, this message from Pope Francis, this way of thinking about common good, and then a call to leadership that is aligned in that direction, really speaks to me about the yearning that we have for integrity in our institutions and in our practices. And I do think that that's a category that is cross-cutting. It returns, actually, Dan, to your opening about a crisis of trust, and that when there is a crisis of trust, it is integrity that allows people to rebuild, to regain some of that doing what you say you will do, and having consistency and uniformity of response. And I wonder about the way in which at these intersections between nonprofit organizations generally, philanthropic institutions, and faith leaders particularly, if there is some practice, some point of engagement that can allow us to focus together on rebuilding that practice of integrity. And I'm just struck that this connects with the hunger for making meaning. Because I think that too often when we're focused on the instrumental, on addressing the urgent problem in front of us, we lose sight of the things that add up, the small things that add up to that degree of integrity. But I hear in your examples within your own institutions at every scope and scale that there is just an opportunity to attend to that meaning making and the way in which it contributes to integrity for a subsector, for an institution, for an individual leader. I just wonder if there are things that you would encourage, or perhaps things that you yourselves practice as leaders that nurture that alignment, nurture that integrity.
Wow. I think integrity, like love, is hard to define, but you know it when you experience it. I mean, Melissa and Dan, you are people of integrity, and it is obvious to me when I first met both of you. And yet I couldn't really tell somebody what I mean by that. I just know it. I know it. I intuit it. I feel it. Your words match your actions match your words. You have one story. You're not pontificating about something and then behaving in a different manner. So integrity is absolutely essential to our work. You know, we Leadership Roundtable exists to strengthen the temporal affairs of the church, the management of people, of finances, of property, of messaging, technology, and to usher in a culture of accountability and openness and ethics and integrity, to restore trust, because we so value the role of the church in people's lives and in the life of the world. So it would be the worst thing we could do as Leadership Roundtable is to fail to emulate what we advocate. Everything has to begin with how we are comporting ourselves. And we spend a lot of time holding ourselves to high levels of accountability as a consequence. When the pandemic began 15, 16 months ago, we all took a deep breath and attended to a few important maxims. People first. You know, there was so much noise and chaos and confusion, but at the end of the day, we had to start with proper care of our most valuable assets, each other. And so we incorporated all kinds of practices through Zooms to check in on each other, to demonstrate that we cared about the real lives of our colleagues. We also took the opportunity to restructure Leadership Roundtable. We eliminated the CEO role and we formed a partnership of 5 co-equal partners, each with our own portfolio, as a way of modeling an alternative to a hierarchical mindset and upholding both Pope Benedict and Pope Francis's call to co-responsibility. So I think beginning with an examination of conscience, are we, each of us, emulating what we advocate, and paying serious attention to that is the starting point.
I'm going to build on what Kerry said, and Melissa, I'm going to slightly rework your question for me and how I process it. I see integrity and trust as byproducts of authentic love. And so Kerry put out a frame when she read Pope Francis, where there was a clarion call to recalibrate a focus on an individual rights and flourishing to a recalibration of a collective flourishing where the individual flourishes in relationship with those around her, him, them. And as a result, that's how I understand love. Love is a focus on flourishing of the other and the kind of self-giving in such a way that both individual and collective flourish at the same time. Integrity is the, in my estimation, the way that Kerry just pointed out, you know it, you experience love in that way, and you begin to trust and build folks, right? You build a sense of, I can lean in, I can become vulnerable. Right now, we're in a moment in which nonprofit organizations have an opportunity to put the flourishing of the community, and someone in the chat put, can we make the common good the new focal point? It's just a beautiful clarion call. If that becomes the organizing principle, then we will naturally build trust and integrity, even if we have missteps in our honest attempt in the flourishing of others. And that's where the real building can take place, and the real trust building, where vulnerability and creativity become integral parts of the community building, the expansion of the common good. So what does that concretely mean? I think Kerry gave a beautiful example around how do we structure power, where we facilitate the interdependence of our leadership, where you can't unilaterally operate as a CEO. You are actually radically dependent on 4 other individuals. Phenomenal example. I think philanthropy can think about how it's radically dependent on grantees or the community as a way of co-creating flourishing. I think nonprofits can engage community in a way where those they aspire to serve have material agency in the design and the execution and the evaluation of the work. It's messy and slow, but if in fact flourishing and common good is the goal, then does it matter if it takes 2 weeks as opposed to 4 or 3 or whatever it may be? So I would just, that's how I processed, I think, the question and Kerry's point. And I think I don't want to absolutize integrity, not that I suggest Kerry was, but I think in a world where individual focus is such a cultural value, integrity becomes a holy grail for myself, as opposed to it being actually the byproduct of love and promoting the common good.
Beautiful, Dan.
I really appreciate the complexity of this and your willingness to say that this is work that can be messy and slow, and that there's merit in that. There's creativity, there's beauty and possibility. I just want to say thank you to both of you. This has been a really remarkable conversation, and clearly we could keep the conversation going. We have received a number of questions through the chat, and I would like to take just a few minutes to pose some of those questions to you, but recognize that for some people an hour has been allotted and taken, so we understand if you're not able to remain with us. As Joe mentioned, the conversation has been recorded. We will include these questions and answers in that recording that will also be shared. Many thanks to Joe and to my colleague Rafia for their organization of these questions, because they are rich and multifaceted, just as this conversation has been. But there are a couple of questions that I wanted to lift up about the way in which faith communities, or perhaps specifically parishes, might address some of this work. So I'm going to share two questions, but I think that they are related. And the first question is this: can the faith communities rebuild a viable center in the United States, one that is now multi-faith rather than centered on the old Protestant establishment, when such large numbers of Americans are dropping out of religious institutions or religious affiliation? And then related to this, what can an Episcopal parish or any congregation do about these long-term trends and hopefully short-term political splits?
Kerry, this is more your bailiwick than mine. I have some probably disruptive ideas, which I'm happy to put forward, but you think about this every day in some way, shape, or form. So I would defer to your wisdom. I'm happy to go, but I'm not trying to offload. I have a point of view, but I will.
Oh, okay, well, I'll be brief and pass it back to you. There was a lot in those kind of twin or triple questions. What leapt out to me were two things. One, the importance of ecumenical and interfaith dialogue and common purpose. That is, I think, essential moving forward if we recognize how interconnected we are, not just in this country, but across the globe. We are interconnected. The pandemic showed that clearly. And so inviting all people of faith, of all faiths, into important dialogue that can issue an action is key. But the best way to engage in ecumenical or interfaith work is to know your tradition well in the first place. No, it's not a watering down to the common denominator that we might all hold together. It's knowing your own tradition and then being open to dialogue and ways of intersection. So that's one point. The focus on parish, Dan had alluded to this earlier when he appealed to the principle of subsidiarity. We are best all of us are best at the local level, at being present to where we are. And parishes are just the way a big global faith community is organized into small local pieces. So the principles that we have been discussing throughout this hour apply to that local level first and foremost. And that can be, I think, the model going forward. And if you look out there, you know those local faith communities that are thriving, that are welcoming to young adults, that invite and utilize lay talent and expertise, that are co-responsible. They're flourishing. There's no magic in that, but they are living out of some core convictions that lead to flourishing.
I would just process the question as a contrarian in this way. What is the end goal? Institutions, in my estimation, are in service of the common good. And then the ideas that are particular to that community and their expression of those common goods. When the institution constrains the evolution or the flourishing of that community, it needs to evolve in such a way as to be a facilitator, not a frustrator. And so I am much more interested, for the reasons Kerry mentioned about subsidiarity, that the community's needs around the expression of its faith in function to the common good should have a kind of principle of creativity that allows for the institutionalization, for reasons she mentioned earlier, like if women, 50% of the population, are precluded from a formal role in leading a community, and that's just deeply problematic and a huge loss to the evolution of that community. So the pressure is building in the system. I would say, so I don't know the Episcopal Church, but if it's the preservation of the institution as per se as it exists, feels to me like the wrong question to ask. It is really, what are we being called to as an institution, and how do we then steward those resources in service of a configuration that allows that community to flourish?
Thank you for these really rich responses. There's a question that I'm going to share, which I think we've now answered in part, but another dimension of this that I do think is particularly germane to parishes, local congregations. The question is this: Dan, you had noted that religious communities can offer redemptive wisdom in this time of polarization, and yet religious communities are also experiencing polarization. It often is internal, and that this leaves leaders feeling deeply anxious, particularly about the loss of members and of donors, if they are speaking to some of those wicked problems that you've named. And I wonder if there is guidance that either one of you would offer to those anxious leaders, those who are concerned about holding together a local community. And then a second part to this question, which I think extends us beyond what we've been discussing: how can philanthropy help religious leaders to navigate this time and challenge and contribute their redemptive wisdom?
Oh boy. So I had an immediate response to the question about the religious leaders stepping into kind of the work of authentically mining the redemptive wisdom of their tradition. In the Christian tradition, we have a very powerful example. It is the cross, right? And it offers an arc of time beyond the temporal as part of the work. I'm unfamiliar with other traditions other than my husband being Jewish. So I spent a lot of time in the Jewish faith as well. And that too has a very powerful set of wisdom and rituals that allow for religious leaders to stand in the midst of complexity and draw on a clarion call to the moment that also talks about the kind of integrity over time. So I just don't think it's I think it's, if we're looking for easy or complacent responses to this, I think it isn't there if we're drawing on the wisdom. So that's my personal take on that. From a philanthropy point of view, is philanthropy can enable religious leaders to be less beholden to a business model that relies on a range of donors in a congregation, and actually give them the freedom to be able to fully step into that work. So there's a really powerful role philanthropy can play, as well as an engine of wisdom, of kind of building community of other religious leaders that are stepping into this work and bringing in. There's lots and lots of ways that philanthropy can play an enabling function without getting involved in the particulars.
And Melissa, I kind of concretely, faith communities of all kinds have such an important role right now as we are emerging from this experience that we all just endured, because faith communities first and foremost ask the meaning question. And they call us, we are invited to ask questions of meaning. And we may never understand why terrible things happen to good people, why tragedies happen, why pandemics can wipe out so many people so instantly. But we may never understand why sorrow, tragedy, bad things happen, but our response to it, we can control, and we can elicit, and we can model what is the meaning in what we have collectively experienced for us. How does it change us fundamentally to be more loving, to be more merciful, to be more aware of our neighbor's suffering, to be more conscious of how interconnected we are as a human family inhabiting a common home? And how does it call us to then be exemplary stewards of potential to benefit others? I think faith communities of all kinds can lead us both in that conversation and by example.
I'm grateful to you, Kerry, for returning us to this idea of stewardship, and particularly stewardship of potential, because I do think that there are a number of places, and I will lift this up as a last question, bringing together a couple of comments and questions that were posed about some of the very incremental ways on the ground that we steward that potential. So some of that is a move from thinking about need in the local community to identifying assets, or taking an asset-based approach. I hear that, Dan, in what you have lifted up in the work that you've done with Independent Sector's conference, and seeking to resource the sector from assets that maybe have been unrecognized or under-recognized or celebrated. But I also see that in thinking about response to some of the need that is revealed by the intersecting pandemics we have been navigating. And I hear it in what you're describing, Kerry, that local community, individual leaders have an opportunity, whether they're in a faith community, in another nonprofit organization, or operating from philanthropy, to be able to intervene with a new frame, a frame that invites appreciation and validation of all kinds of actors. There was a specific question from someone who works with gleaners, and I'm really appreciative of this, about the challenge of inviting people to move from thinking about the urgency of feeding someone who is hungry, while simultaneously letting go of the judgment about why a person might be hungry. Or maybe that is about a shift from thinking about need to thinking about asset, shift from thinking about the individual to thinking about the collective. So I just lift that up to you and just offer it as a point of connection, that sometimes these things really land on the ground, even when we're able to talk about them in abstraction. And I'm grateful to each of you for the examples that you've given from your own context about implementation and practice, because I think that does translate to the practices that we can all be engaged in. So really grateful for that particular question, because I think it drives us to the application, to the meaning making that is at the intersection. I would just invite each of you, if you have a last word of wisdom that you would share with the group, and then we will close out our conversation for this afternoon. Just so grateful for your time and insight.
I think Kerry should get the last word because I'm more interested in what she has to say. I guess first of all, I just want to thank you all for this conversation. I really have been pushed in my thinking and learning. So that has been, for me, a gift. I'll go back to, I think, something that I'm just thinking all the time about is that I think we as a nation are paying a terrible opportunity cost by not actively engaging the wonderful pluralism of faith traditions and the redemptive wisdom about how to navigate this moment where we're turning on ourselves and saying, how could we be who we're now having to confront who we are? That a legacy of slavery and its continued presence in structural racism, legacy of homophobia, legacy of sexism. I mean, and all of a sudden this stuff is coming at us, and if we don't have the ability to stand in it, be able to hold it as true, and also hold that there are truths that still are in there that are valuable to fight for and can guide our way out. And I think the institutions that have spent millennia in some cases figuring this out have to be brought into the public square, not to be absolutized, but to be powerful sources of wisdom. And I think we're going to get caught into a doom loop unless we step into that work. And I think many people on this call are uniquely positioned to be able to step into that work.
And I would just like to say thank you, Melissa and Dan, and to all of the participants who joined us. My closing comment, I think, would be to say that I think generosity is humankind's birthright, and that we are all called to be generous and to be catalysts to inspire generosity in others. And when I use generosity, I'm not speaking just of material generosity. We can be generous with our time. We can be generous with our creative solutions to challenges. We can be generous by extending the benefit of the doubt, by presuming goodness in one another. And I think that there's a role for people who are naturally leaders or involved in the nonprofit sector and or the faith-based sector to lead the way in this. So thank you so much for including me. And Dan and I are not just Hoyas, alumni of Georgetown, we are classmates. So it was a happy reunion to be
It was
back
indeed.
with you.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Well, thank you both so very much. Kerry, Dan, it has been a pleasure and a privilege to spend some time with you this afternoon. Many thanks to Joe Swimmer and the CEEP Network for providing us with support and bringing us together. And we look forward to continued conversation with those of you who have joined us as participants. You can expect to hear from us in the next day or so with some additional follow-up and a link to the recording for this webinar. Thank you very much. Go in peace.
Thank you very much. Take care.